Okay, so what we are going to go ahead and do in the notes today, I just want to take a minute or two to just review the concept of the biconditional since it was kind of rushed in the last video. A right angle measures 90 degrees, and this is all written out, you guys, on page 3 in your packet. So if you don't have your notes out, go ahead and pause it, please. Take out your notes packet and let's look at page 3. And we know that if I said an angle measures 90 degrees, if I wanted to write that as an if-then statement, we want to make the first statement your if and your second statement the then. So here, if I said if right angle, then 90 degrees, well, it just doesn't sound grammatically correct. So all we have to do is add in a couple of key words to make it sound a little bit better. But the general idea should be something along the lines, if an angle is a right angle, then it measures 90 degrees. Now, the converse, and we would say this is true, the converse is when we just switch the two. There's no nots in the converse, so it's going to be really important that we work on remembering that. The converse of this statement would say, if it measures 90 degrees. If an angle measures 90 degrees, then it is a right angle. And we would also say that is true. So that is why we're allowed to write the biconditional, if the conditional and the converse are both true. What that means to me is we should be able to read it both ways when we see if and only if. An angle is a right angle if and only if it measures 90 degrees, or an angle that measures 90 degrees is a right angle. It means you should be able to read it both ways and the statement still be true. So make sure we have page 3 totally complete. And then we're going to go ahead and talk about some of our new symbolic notations that we're going to see during chapter 2 and for the rest of the year. So if I quickly just take a second and talk about some of the symbols we've already worked on in geometry, we know that if I draw two lines like that, then I want you to assume that I'm talking about parallel lines. We know if I draw an upside down T, I want you to know we're talking about perpendicular. We also know, and maybe that's it for right now. So if we go ahead and we look at some of our conditional statements, we're going to start putting the whole hypothesis and label it as a P. So we're going to let P represent hypothesis, and we're going to let the Q represent conclusion. So then if I draw an arrow is actually going to represent if then. And we're about to talk about that down here. So for the time being, just write down if then, and we actually put the arrow in between the two letters we're going to use to represent the if then. Now, we just talked about the if and only if. This is the biconditional scenario. And with this, it's the double arrow. You don't have to draw it with the two lines like this. People always get a little confused by that. You can just write it like this. That's easier, and that means biconditional. And the double arrow, if we remember what biconditional means the statement works both ways. So you should be able to read it left to right or right to left. If we put a squiggle in the front, a squiggle means not. And then we've got the statements down here, or the symbols down here. Either one of these represent and, so you can draw an upside down U or an upside down V, and they both represent the and statement, as opposed to if you draw a U or a V, it represents or. So we're just going to use one of these, and you should recognize that they both mean the same thing. And then if we draw the three dots that look like a triangle, it means therefore. So if we think about our conditional statement is our if-then original statement, where we would say, if hypothesis, then conclusion. So we have the P for hypothesis, the Q for conclusion, and this arrow for the if-then. So we would say P arrow Q. So the converse we've already talked about is if conclusion, then hypothesis. So instead of having P to Q, we're going to have Q arrow P. So notice the arrow is always going to be written in between the two, but it actually means if, then. So if Q, then P. The inverse. The inverse we know is not P, then not Q. If not hypothesis, then not conclusion. So we just talked up here that the little squiggle means not. So we're going to say squiggle P, arrow, squiggle Q. So then we've got these last two to fill in here, where here contrapositive is the not, and flipped. So not conclusion. All right. So not conclusion, then not hypothesis. Oh, yeah. Okay. So not conclusion, then not hypothesis. And so in our symbolic notation, that's going to be a not Q, arrow, not P. And then the last one is our if and only if, and we're going to write it with that double arrow. Which again, remember, if you don't like to write the arrow like this, you really are just writing a plain old arrow, but two sides and then Q. So let's take an example or start looking at times where we could use our symbolic notation. It just shortens everything for us. So if I say X represents it as Friday, Y represents there's a football game, and Z represents I have homework, then I would say I have homework and there is a football game. So I have homework is Z. So this is Z. And if we go back and look at your symbols, and is the upside down V or U. And I forgot to mention it over here. I kind of like to remember these because you could draw the line and make them look like A's for and. So that's how I remember that these get the upside down U's and V's. So if we come back over here, I'm going to take our I have homework and there is a football game. So we would write it like that. If you prefer to do the upside down U, it means the exact same thing. If, then, notice I have an if, then statement here. So that means I need an arrow in the middle of my statement. It is not Friday. So not Friday means not squiggle X, arrow, I do have homework. So that's Z. So squiggle X, arrow Z would represent this sentence. There is a football game if and only if it is Friday. So here, football game is Y. If and only if is the double arrow. It is Friday, which is X. And then our last one says, if it is Friday, then, so look at my if then statement. So this means I should have an arrow in the middle. If doesn't get something in the front, we just read the arrow to mean if it is Friday, which is X, then there is a football game and I don't have homework. So we're going to come back up here and use this and symbol again. I don't have homework would mean not Z. And since both of these are kind of in my then statement, we would actually want to put parentheses around that. So if we look at actually translating using these same concepts, X and Y is what this one reads. Upside down U, which would look like an A, right? Then X and Y would mean it is Friday and there is a football game. If we look over here, This is my if-then statement. So be careful with these arrows that you recognize. We need to have an if. So not X, if it is not Friday. Then I do not have homework. Then I don't have homework. And then the last one is this therefore statement. So I'm going to write this one just over here off to the side. So it is Friday. Therefore, there is a football game. So one of the things I just want you to realize here, I do want you to go and do as much of page 5 as you can. I want you to realize none of you have learned these symbols before or have seen these symbols before, so this is kind of like vocabulary in an English class. You do have to go back and study these symbols and just learn to recognize them and learn how to fill in these based on symbolic notation. So I would recommend maybe considering some flashcards in this unit to get used to all of the vocab. And so start studying it and practice it and try to fill in all of page 5 for me based on these examples we just walked through in this video.